Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm President Tim Gibson of the King's College, New York City, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening for the launch event of our Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience. One of the privileges of my role in the President's office is I'm often privy to seeing the very beginning of an idea carried all the way through to its fruition. And that's what we're witnessing here this evening. This launch event is the culmination of a 5 or 6 year journey that the King's College has been on, beginning with the President's Commission on Multi-Ethnicity, the report that came out of that commission, and then the recommendations that were subsequently derived from that report. The establishment of this center and the launch of this center this evening is in fact yet another milestone on that journey that we're upon together as a community. And so I am particularly pleased that the 2 of the 9 members of that commission are tonight panelists that will be helping us unpack what the center is about, the mission of the center, and the activities that we know are going to contribute to taking this conversation further in advancing the contribution that the King's College makes into a broader community. And so with that as our backdrop, I am particularly pleased to introduce our Provost, Dr. Mark Hijleh, to then subsequently introduce our panelists and enjoy this evening.
Thank you, President Gibson. It's a great delight to be here for this really incredible and important launch event for the Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience at the King's College. I've been fortunate enough to have been part of the conceiving of and executing the start of the center. And so I want to thank Dr. Tubbs and the others I'll introduce here in just a moment for the opportunity to be part of this really exciting venture. The mission statement for this center is as follows: through teaching, research, scholarly writing, and public engagement, the center seeks to increase our knowledge of Black Christian communities' influence on the faith around the globe, with critical attention to the ancient, modern, and future roles of the Black Church and its contributions to worldwide Christianity, including the civic dimensions of its work. And so it is a wonderful mission and an attempt to understand the importance of the Black community across the globe in the formation and subsequent history of Christianity from its very beginnings up to the present time. It is a mission-driven initiative, just as the King's College is a mission-driven institution. And so it is a match made in heaven, and we look forward to seeing where we can go. I also have the privilege tonight of introducing our 3 participants in this event. And I want to start with the Associate Director of the Center, and that is Dr. Dami Kabiawu. She's an Assistant Professor of Finance in the Business and Finance Department at the King's College. Dr. Kabiawu holds a PhD in finance from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute here in New York, and also took an undergraduate degree from London South Bank University in computer science. So she is well-versed in technology, and also her research is around the area of behavioral finance, focusing on the impact of human characteristics in that field. And prior to working in academia, Dr. Kabiawu held positions in the professional finance world, also in IT and security, and in management reporting and financial application development. The director for the Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience is Dr. David Tubbs, who earned his PhD in politics at Princeton, concentrating in political philosophy, constitutional law, and Russian studies. And Dr. Tubbs has been at King since 2005. His book, Freedom's Orphans, was published by Princeton University in 2007, and he's had writing appear in the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Academic Questions, Public Discourse, Touchstone, First Things, National Review, The American Spectator, and The New Criterion. In 2010, Dr. Tubbs received the Faculty of the Year Award for academic excellence given by students here at King's. He's also lectured in Russia, the Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. And he's also been the W.H. Brady Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, a visiting associate professor of politics at Princeton, and the Ann and Herbert W. Vaughn Visiting Fellow at the James Madison Program at Princeton. And then finally, our featured speaker tonight is Senior Fellow of the Center, Dr. Jacqueline C. Rivers. Dr. Rivers holds her PhD from Harvard, where she was a doctoral fellow in the multidisciplinary program in inequality and social policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and also a graduate research fellow of the National Science Foundation. She's a graduate of Harvard Radcliffe College prior to that, and she's also currently the executive director and senior fellow for social science and policy of the Seymour Institute for the Black Church and Policy Studies. She's also served as a lecturer in both sociology and African American studies at Harvard, and has presented at Princeton, Notre Dame, University of Pennsylvania, the Vatican, Stanford, and the United Nations. Her publications include The Paradox of the Black Church and Religious Freedom in the volume Not Just Good, But Beautiful, and another co-authored with Orlando Patterson in The Cultural Matrix, published by Harvard University Press. Dr. Rivers is currently teaching at King's, a course on the history of the Black Church, and this coming fall, she will offer a second course here on the history of slavery and emancipation in the West. So we have a wonderful program in store for you this evening. It's a great honor to welcome you. And now I'd like to turn over the program to Center Director, Dr. David Tubbs.
Thank you, Dr. Hijleh. So I just wanted to describe briefly the format for this evening. We've prepared some questions. Dr. Kabiawu and I have prepared some questions for Dr. Rivers. We will alternate. Dr. Kabiawu asks the first question, and then alternate for the remainder of the interview. And with that, I'd like to turn to Dr. Kabiawu for the first question for Dr. Rivers.
Dr. Rivers, it's a pleasure to see you as always. I know that a lot of our students have had the opportunity to interact with you. They've met you when you've been here to do a presentation for Black History Month, sometimes by yourself and sometimes with your husband. I think we want to take this opportunity to introduce you a little bit more to the King's world, to our faculty, our students, staff, alumni, and all the well-wishers working from home. So can you tell us a little bit about your life inside and outside of the academy? And also tell us a little bit about what led you to Harvard and why you decided to pursue your PhD from there.
Thank you. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, Dr. Tubbs, Dr. Kabiawu. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm just delighted at all that is happening with the center. So, you know, the story of my involvement with Harvard is a long one, because actually Harvard brought me to the United States and to Boston. I came as an undergraduate many years ago, and as a result of that, that's actually where I met Reverend Rivers. We were both undergraduates, and we were committed to doing work among the Black poor. And I was, as a young Christian, I was so excited by the prospect of doing that work. It was really as a result of that I decided to stay in the United States, to stay in Boston, and then subsequently my husband and I got married. So this passion for working on issues of racial justice from a Christian perspective, really as a part of the Black church, has been a driving motivation in my life for the last 40 years. And I did a lot of work on racial justice from two perspectives. We, Reverend Rivers and I, were part of a small intentional community that moved into a poor Black neighborhood that turned out to be extremely violent. But we really felt that's where God had called us to serve. And so as a result, we had the faith to stay in the middle of that community and to really minister to young people who were caught up in violence, who were caught up in dealing drugs, who were caught up in gangs. And we saw God did something amazing there in Massachusetts. There were a lot of factors involved, but part of it was really launching a coalition of churches that worked on this issue of violence. So that was one aspect of the racial justice that I was involved with, and always an element of economic justice as well. The other thing that I did around these issues of racial and economic justice was to work on educational issues, working with the famous civil rights activist, Bob Moses, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Bob launched something called the Algebra Project, recognizing that access to mathematical knowledge was really a civil rights issue for young Black men in particular, but women as well, in the inner city and in rural areas. And so I worked closely with Bob for 18 years doing that. In the meantime, raised a family. Our children both went on to Harvard, and at that point, I was really feeling the need for some renewal myself, and also thinking that there were other avenues that needed to be explored, that some of what was driving the issues of racial injustice and economic injustice were the ideas behind them, the things that people believed, the lack of understanding, and that some of the intellectual foundations needed to be explored. And that's what took me back to Harvard to do my PhD in African American Studies and Sociology. And I was really drawn to the multidisciplinary program in social inequality at Harvard because of the potential to change the way things are structured in society and the potential to change the way people understand things and work for social justice from that angle. And the other thing I would just add is I'd also promised my father that I would one day do that PhD.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Rivers. So I have a question that builds in part on Dr. Kabiawu's question. Could you tell us what drew you to the King's College and what are some of your hopes for the new Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience?
So I have to tell you, Dr. Tubbs, that you were a big draw to King's College. Your passion for this center, your enthusiasm for it, and the friendship that developed between you, Reverend Rivers, and me when we met at the Vita Institute really had a lot to do with putting King's on the radar for me in a very important way. And when you did invite us here, both Reverend Rivers and me, we were so warmly received by the administration, by the faculty, by the students. There was really genuine interest in addressing these issues around Christianity and the Black church. And that was very engaging. And the excitement around the ideas in the center that the Black church has always been the premier institution in the Black community. It's always had a pivotal role. Before there was a Black church, when it was the invisible institution, when slaves were stealing away to brush harbors, to pray together, and to subvert the very understanding of Christianity that slaveholders were trying to force on them. Christianity has just played such an important role for enslaved Africans, for African Americans. And so the focus in the center on this combination of Christianity and the Black experience was just very exciting. And the collegiality, the idea of a college that was focused on the tenets of Christian faith and really sought to be faithful to that was also very attractive. Because increasingly in academia, that is just not allowed. Well, I don't want to put it that strongly because I think it's actually in some ways more insidious than that. It's just quietly devalued, ignored. Faith is not even worth rejecting. It's just so ludicrous. So the idea of being in a place where one could seek intellectual rigor, at the same time embracing Christian faith, was very attractive. And I have to say, I am really enjoying my experience teaching here for the first time this spring. My students are so engaged and so the conversations are so lively and interesting and stimulating that I've been enjoying it a great deal. So my hope for the center, one of the things that I think drives much of what I want to do is to see lifted up, highlighted, fleshed out the biblical mandate for justice and how that impacts on the issue of racial injustice. And closely tied to that is economic injustice. Because very rarely today are you going to find a law that is explicitly racially biased. Much more often you're going to find that African Americans are disadvantaged because of an existing legacy which has deep economic roots and that puts them at a deep disadvantage. So I think that in the church, this is not true in the Black church, but I think in the white church, there's really a lack of awareness of the biblical focus on justice and of our responsibility as Christians to address issues of racial, economic injustice. And I really want to see the center working on that, introducing white Christians to the truth of the historic racial injustices that African Americans have endured, for them to see that this is not just, it's not just a matter of my perception versus your perception, but really to see that there is historical data, that there is a historical record that supports this. I think another important thing is to begin to engage the reality of structural constraints. Not everything that people in the world, Americans in particular, African Americans in even more particularly, experience, not everything is due to structural constraints. People make decisions, people have responsibility for personal decisions, but it is also really important to face and understand the fact that some people are born with disadvantages which are close to overwhelming. And some people are born with advantages which are almost, you almost can't throw them away. They're so enormous. And we as the church ought to be aware of that, even as we deal with personal responsibility. So to me, that's one of the important agenda items for the center. But I think it's also important here at King's to be providing support for African-American students and to increase the appeal of the college for students who are coming from the Black church, who are the backbone of the Black church, who are the future of the Black church, and who are so often drifting away from the church when they're going to secular institutions. So I want to see the center being more attractive to those students and to support the Black church in, as the mission of the center says, the role of shaping the faith. How do we work on racial justice, racial reconciliation? How do we continue that role of shaping Christian faith? And with the enormous rise of Christianity in Africa, with Africa becoming the global center for Christian faith, we as a center need to be capturing that, documenting that, disseminating information about that, sponsoring research that will deepen our understanding both of what's happening with the church in Africa and what's happening with the church here in the United States. This is certainly a period of enormous change in the church. We need to be studying it, understanding it, and helping churches, equipping churches to think through this period of change. so that we can actually survive it in a really powerful way, because it's a time when the church could really be very negatively impacted by the trends that are developing. And of course, to support the church in engaging on issues of economic and racial justice. I want to turn the tables on you, Dr. Tubbs, because it is your vision for the center that has really drawn me. I want you to talk a little bit about it.
So I agree with everything you said. And for me, a very important part of the center's work is to increase knowledge among white students attending King's of the historical realities that you described. I believe that it's crucial for all students at King's to have broad knowledge of the history of slavery, the struggle for emancipation in the Western world. At King's, we do spend a lot of time on the history of the United States, American political thought. I would like all students at King's to have greater appreciation, not only of the struggle to abolish slavery, but the great step backwards, namely the end of Reconstruction, the rise of segregation, the struggles to end segregation. There's so much that's deeply inspiring there. I mean, I sometimes find it curious when people say, well, where are young people today, young adults looking for heroes? There are great heroes in our political tradition, all the people that fought to end slavery, those people who fought in so many different ways to end segregation, the injustices associated with segregation. And I believe that it's just essential for educated Americans in this century to have that body of knowledge. The other part of it, I would say, is that there are national discussions going on, and we're going to talk about those a little bit more in the interview. And I believe very quickly college graduates, if they want to be making a contribution to those national discussions, they need to understand this history very well, very well. The college graduates who are trying to participate in these discussions, who have superficial knowledge, really are not going to be making big contributions to those conversations. So that's a very important part of, I guess, my vision for the center and its future. So thank you.
I think that's so well said. And I think it's also important because as we are able to educate students, they can begin to share what they understand, even with those who don't have the privilege of being college educated, and really begin to change the perceptions in the society at large.
Thank you. So I will turn it back to Dr. Kabiawu for her next question.
Thank you for that very, very important exchange that you've had. But I will say that one of the questions I had to ask myself as a finance professor is, what is my role in this community here? Because I teach finance and numbers, and here I am being all gung-ho for this center as well. And I think part of that question also is because I'm an immigrant, right? And as an immigrant, some of that story is missing. As a first-generation immigrant, I lose some of the story of how the Black experience, how we've come to this point that we're in this particular time. And this also kind of underscores what we can do to educate that community, as well as the white community, as well as other Black American communities as well. So,
You know, I also, I'm from Jamaica, and I'm well aware of the gulf that can exist between first generation immigrants, well, immigrants in general, and African Americans. You are absolutely so right.
So there's so much more I want to say about this, right? But I'll go to the next question so that we don't use up too much time. But I want to delve a little bit more into your scholarship. Sometime last year, after the death of Mr. George Floyd, you wrote a very, very insightful essay, A Christian Response in the Face of Injustice. That essay was published in Religion Unplugged, and I've seen it reposted on several other websites as well. So for those members in the audience that have no idea, that haven't read this essay, And also because the anniversary of Mr. Floyd's death is next month, can you summarize the views you presented in that essay and also talk to us about further reflections because of this anniversary coming up, if there's anything else you want to add at this time?
Thank you. You know, this really was an opportunity, and I was grateful for the opportunity from Religion Unplugged to begin to do some of the things we were just talking about for the center. I think for a lot of white Christians, they agreed that what Derek Chauvin had done was horrifying. And people were not standing up to defend his behavior. But at the same time, I think the level of anger and outrage that African Americans were expressing, that young people were expressing, because people of all races and all ages were expressing, was bewildering, I think, to some Christians, some white Christians in particular. And what I wanted to say was, this is, as horrific as this incident is, it's not just about this incident. It's about the history that we've been discussing. It's about the fact that there is a very long line of African American, especially African American men, who were unarmed and who have suffered violence, even death, at the hands of the very officers of the law who were supposed to protect and serve them. And that was, it was important for me to point out that this wasn't, and there have been so many incidents recently because they're captured on video, which people are aware of. Breonna Taylor, it's just so many others that have happened. And what I was trying to say is, but long before they were being captured on video, these incidents were happening. Back in the 80s, there were riots in Miami because a man was stopped by police and killed. And in incident after incident, there has failed to be any kind of justice served. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. And then I wanted to say, it's not just about police brutality. It's also about these broader incidents of racial injustice, which are closely tied to this. So, and I wanted to make the case that we as a church have a particular role to play. You know, the Bible says that if we won't praise God, he will make the rocks cry out. Well, to some extent, young, perhaps even atheistic, non-Christian young people, some of them African-American, some of them white, have been the rocks crying out. They've been the ones crying out for justice. And we, the people of God, have been silent. And that was another important message that I wanted to raise. A third point was, it's true, and I think this impacted a lot of conservative whites very strongly, that some of these protests did devolve into riots. But I just wanted to remind everyone that it was really a minority of protests that ended that way. And it was a tiny minority of the numbers of people who marched in protest who ended up involved in looting and rioting. And that was, and which does not excuse the rioting. In fact, not only does it not excuse it, the rioting is actually counterproductive because it turns potential allies against those who are fighting for justice. So as much as it is deplorable, the rioting is deplorable, but I wanted people to understand the anger and to remember that it was only a small minority. And then to call on us as Christians to stand up for change, to stand up for changes in the way police violence was investigated, because the police work very closely with district attorney's offices. How can we put in place independent investigators who aren't as closely affiliated with police officers and have them conduct these investigations? What can we do about laws that favor the police? Laws which say that all a police officer has to do is say, yes, he was running away from me, but I was afraid for my life, and therefore I shot him in the back. And it didn't work. It doesn't work in all cases. In South Carolina, a police officer was actually convicted in a case just like that in Charleston, South Carolina. But in many cases, police are able to make claims which on the face of it are not credible and to escape because they claim to have been afraid. How can we revisit those laws? But it really takes a huge change in mindset, because these are not just federal laws, these are also state laws, a real change in mindset across the country that will take decades for us to foster. But we as Christians should be leading that charge. We should be the ones saying this is what needs to happen. So I wanted to engage with the church around these questions of what did George Floyd's death mean? What did the outcry against it? What were the roots? And what should we as a church be doing in response? How could we actually make meaningful change? What strikes me now is even as Derek Chauvin is being tried, is once again, you're hearing reporters make the comment, that jurors very rarely find against police officers. And even in this case, I don't think there's a single commentator I've heard who says this is a slam dunk, that this man who was captured on tape with his knee on the neck of another man for over 9 minutes would definitely be convicted of any of the 3 charges brought against him, because he was charged 3 times in order to make sure that one of them would stick. So that just says to me, once again, reinforces the fact that this is a decades-long struggle, that we have to really change the mindset of jurors and change laws and change the broader mindset of the country. The other thing that I called for in that article is really a change even in how we prepare police to interact on the streets, to teach them to de-escalate rather than to end up in a situation where we have to pin a man to the ground, to teach them racial sensitivity so that they're aware of the biases that they're bringing, because very often they are bringing bias into the job with them. So those things are still very much needed. And it strikes me that there's just been, and I'm not entirely surprised, but I was hopeful. I really was hopeful given the outpouring outrage, but the lack of structural change. Even in Milwaukee, it appears that the commitments to change the way policing is done have not been implemented. No, I think that there was really an overreach in the goals. Talking about abolishing the police, I think that that's, I don't want to be dismissive, but I think that's an overreach. I don't think you're going to get a lot of public support behind the idea of abolishing the police. The idea that there needs to be reform, that resources should be put in place so that some of these calls for help, maybe in cases of domestic violence, certainly in cases where you have somebody who's mentally ill, it's not necessarily a police officer who is responding, or not only a police officer. I think that is the kind of careful formulation that we can build support behind. I think some of the calls were really overblown and counterproductive as a result, and in Milwaukee it hasn't stuck. In Boston, there actually has been some change put in place. At the state level, Massachusetts was late to the game, but there was an agency put in place to certify police to prevent another very pernicious thing in which a police officer who has done something egregious in one location can get fired there and go find a job somewhere else. Having this oversight board in place that licensed police officers is one way to try and prevent that. So there's been some structural change in a couple of locations, but it's very difficult, and the church ought to be on the ground in this fight because it's going to take a long time for us to actually have the kind of impact that we need to see.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go on, David.
So my next question builds on Dr. Kabiawu's question, and that is the many conversations that began last year regarding the history of race relations in the United States. In your judgment, did those conversations amount to a national discussion on the history of race relations in the United States? And could those discussions taken as a whole be described as historically unprecedented? I'd welcome your answer to those questions and any additional thoughts on this topic you might have.
So I'm always a little unsure about what people mean by this idea of a national conversation. And perhaps what we had last year was more of a shouting match. But I do think it is true that many more people were engaged in thinking about issues of racial justice and of police violence directed against young Black men last year. And I don't want to claim that I have historical knowledge to really make grand claims, but it does seem as though this was much more in the minds and hearts of people, that this was something that was getting a lot more attention than it normally does get. I think it's also true that we have this complicated situation in which there has been progress on racial justice over the centuries. Today, in one of my classes at Harvard, I remember saying to one of my students, and I mean, I was amazed because this was not even an undergraduate, this was a graduate student, and obviously a smart young man, but he was saying, you know, I was challenging them. I said, are you trying to tell me things are the worst they have ever been in the United States? They're the worst now? Do you think that the people who lived under slavery, if they could change places with you, this was actually a young white man, if they could change places with an African American today, that they would agree with the assessment that things are the worst they have ever been? Do you think somebody growing up under Jim Crow would agree with that assessment? And what was striking was that he's like, you know, I guess we don't think about that. There is a kind of lack of historical analysis or historical context when people seem to claim that there's been no progress. There has been progress, but it's been very complicated progress, because the other thing that tends to happen is one form of racial oppression morphs into another form. So slavery ends, but as you pointed out, Dr. Tubbs, you have the end of Reconstruction, you have what's called redemption, and the emergence of Jim Crow segregation, which in some ways was slavery by another name. You have the civil rights movement, which brings an end to the kind of terror, not just the segregation, but the terror that reigned in the South, where Black men were lynched without any accountability, where people who attended lynchings could have their photographs published on the front page of the newspaper with total impunity. That ended with the civil rights movement, but then you have the rise of mass incarceration, which is so massively disproportionately victimizing young Black men. So there's a sense in which there's been progress, but there's also a kind of continuity in the racial oppression. So I think we had, to put it in the words of my mentor, Bob Moses, he says, the country tends to lurch at these points of change. World War II was an opportunity for the country to lurch, and it lurched forward. It lurched in a more equitable direction with the civil rights movement. And I heard Bob Moses saying, we're at a point again where the country may be ready to lurch, but in which direction will it lurch? And every time there is a lurch towards justice, there tends to be a backlash. And so I would say that we in the church should be working to capitalize on any openness for a movement towards greater justice, but we should be very vigilant against a coming backlash that might result in some new version of racial oppression.
Thank you. Dr. Kabiawu, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to bring it a little bit backwards to your teaching at the King's College, right? I hope that while you're teaching, I have the opportunity to audit your class. I've wanted to do that for Dr. Tubbs, and I definitely want to do this for your class as well. But as a senior fellow of the center, I know that you're going to be teaching, you are teaching 2 courses, right? And you have some more scheduled. So can you tell us a little bit about the courses that you're teaching and if they fit together, how they fit together?
Right. So right now I am teaching a course on the Black church in slavery and freedom. And it's a combination of a historical look at the church, because as I said, we start out in slavery and we trace the history of the church up to the 21st century. It also really looks at the theology of the Black church, which is, as I said to my students early in the course, it's not the typical theology. It's really a theology that's drawn much more out of practice than out of a more esoteric or more intellectual kind of study of the Bible. We have looked at Bishop Richard Allen and the struggle for founding, how a Black denomination came out of the failure of the white church. So the Second Great Awakening is an opportunity. It's a time when evangelical whites are doing radical racial equality. They even have slave pastors of some white churches. It's radical equality. But they begin to retreat from that. And now Richard Allen and his fellows are in a church where segregation is being imposed. And the standing up against that indignity, against that rejection of their humanity is what leads to the foundation of the first Black church. So we're looking at the theological roots and women in the Black church and where's the theology behind the amazing role that Baptist women in particular, we looked at Baptist women in particular, the role that they have played, and Black liberation theology. And then we will go on and look at how central an institution the Black church is in the community, from Du Bois to Eddie Glaude, who has been known to publish an article talking about the Black church is dead. And even more important, the role that the church has played in the struggle for racial justice. So that's kind of a quick summary of the topics we've been reading about, discussing. Very much an engaging, let's talk this through, let's grapple with these issues seminar approach to the topics, which I think my students have found very engaging. Certainly our discussions have been very lively. And I'm enjoying getting them now to put all of this into arguments. I'm like, okay, now we've got to get this all down on paper. So that's a stage that we're at, but it's been a very engaging class. In the fall, I'll be teaching a history of slavery and emancipation in the West, starting with the philosophical underpinnings of Western slavery and abolition. So how does, in an age of enlightenment, how is it that the West is involved in the transatlantic slave trade? How does it endure so long? What are the roots in ancient Greece and Christian thought and the Enlightenment behind this system? And then how was it actually practiced and implemented? We look a little bit at South America and the Caribbean, but really looking at how it happens in different regions, how the mid-Atlantic slavery is different from the slavery of the Deep South, how the internal slave trade develops. and also the importance in the period in which slavery is being practiced. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who is a professor of history at Harvard University and was chair of the history department, spoke for a group of students that I work with. In fact, some of my students from King's attended this seminar that she gave on Saturday. And she was talking about how different slavery looked in Richmond, how an industrial city, often slaves were almost free. But even in a situation where these were slaves who had the wherewithal to have, and she has amazing photographs of her family, even while they were enslaved. And if you looked at these photographs, you would have said, no, that is not a slave. A beautifully dressed young woman, very poised and very dignified, but she was sold away from her family. So in the midst of this very different form of slavery, the core experience of belonging to someone else, someone having that kind of power over your life was still true. We'll be looking at those kinds of issues. And then how did it then, what was this like? What was this like for those who experienced slavery? We'll read the autobiography of Sojourner Truth. What was it like for somebody who had to live under this system? And how did it end? How did Black abolitionists and white abolitionists come together to end this horrific system? But how does it still endure? What are the consequences in Jim Crow, in sharecropping and the Black codes, and even more recently, racialized mass incarceration? So those are some of the topics that we will be dealing with. And again, very much a seminar style where we're in discussion and engaged and exchanging ideas. And I'm looking forward to doing that in the fall.
Thank you. David?
Thank you. So I have one more prepared question, but a lot of questions are coming in from the audience. And so
Okay.
I think I'm going to hold off on asking the final prepared question I have so that I can give you an opportunity to engage with the audience. So the first question will be pretty easy. It follows naturally from what you were just discussing, and that is one audience member would like a few book recommendations. So if I could narrow it a bit, the course that you're teaching this semester and the course that you'll be teaching in the fall, could you recommend one or two books from both courses that might be valuable for our audience members who don't have the opportunity to take either of these courses with you?
Yes, so actually I'm going to start with a book that isn't on the reading list for either of these courses, but which is a great favorite of mine. And that is When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katz Nelson. I strongly recommend that book. Albert Rabato's Slave Institution is, The Slave Church is also an incredible book that we are reading. And The God of the Oppressed by James Cone really gives a sense of Black liberation theology. So those are some books from the course that I think are important. And I have to say, I love Righteous Discontent by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, which is one of the books that, I just mentioned, she did that presentation for us. And that's really a book that's looking at the role of Baptist women and how it's just she makes such a complex argument about their standing up for racial justice, even in the midst of a church where their rights as women are being denied, and how all of this is grounded in their understanding, in their biblical understanding. So I would recommend all of those. Those are definitely some strong ones. Let me see if there's anything else that I should add to that list.
If I could ask a question for the fall semester.
Yes.
I saw your reading list for the fall semester, and you're assigning the David Brian Davis.
Yes, thank you.
Books,
I was just trying.
Inhuman Bondage, which I think is a magnificent work.
Yes, and the other one that in addition to David Brian Davis, I really love the book by Ira Berlin, Many Thousands Gone. He really paints this very complicated picture of how slavery differed, because I mean, we say slavery as though it was always the same, but it was really morphing and changing throughout history in the United States, and he paints that picture. And I would also recommend Sojourner Truth, A Bondswoman of Olden Time, which you, Professor Tubbs, recommended to me, and I strongly recommend that as well.
Wonderful.
Slavery by Another Name, for a more, on the consequences.
Okay, so I'm going to keep going with audience questions here. There's an interesting question about narratives. And one question is, what would you say in response to a person who believes that deep knowledge of the Black experience, thorough grounding in the history of slavery and segregation, the struggle for freedom, equality, justice, contributes to, in the judgment of some Americans, a lot of victim narratives? How would you respond? You conceded there have been significant changes in American history over the centuries. And what if somebody were to say to you, well, all of these narratives about the past, about these struggles, these injustices, they amount to a kind of narrative of victimhood? That's the question from the audience member. What would you say in response to a person that makes such an assertion?
So I think that there's a danger of African Americans seeing ourselves as victims. But I think that is that's part of the struggle. When you're on the underside of history, that's part of the struggle, that you don't give in to that perception of yourself as a victim, but that you continue to work. And Dr. Tubbs, we did a seminar, you and I, I think it was in May, in which we were talking about Martin Luther King Jr. And we were talking about his presenting to middle school students and saying to them, I know that you are up against these odds. I know these odds are real, but you have got to strive to be the very best you can be. And that is a message that I think the Black church definitely promotes. Whatever the world, in fact, African Americans in general, they say you have to be twice as good in order to get half as far. So African Americans push back against that victimhood and say, what we're going to do, the way we're going to respond to the situation we're in, we're going to work harder, be better, so that we can overcome the obstacles we face. And I think that that's what we ought to be saying to people who ask us a victimhood question. But I think the other thing we ought to be saying is, what are you doing about engaging with the real structural differences? What are you, who are concerned about victimization narratives, what are you doing about the fact that Black children, you can tell the outcome? Raj Chetty, economist at Harvard University, has found you can predict the outcome of a child's life by where the child is born, by what race the child is. What are you doing about those structural realities? Those facts, innocent child hasn't embraced any victimhood narratives, hasn't made any bad decisions, but you can still predict what's going to happen in their lives based on race and location.
Very helpful. So I wanted to mention the following, take just a quick break from the questions, because some people, they appreciate the list of books that you gave, and they're wondering whether we could post a book list. I think maybe the easiest thing would be anybody in the audience who would like to request a copy of Dr. Rivers' syllabus for this semester, readings from her course to be offered in the fall semester. Anybody in the audience could write to her at the King's College, jrivers tkc.edu. Similarly, audience members should feel free to write to me if they want to see the syllabus for, say, the civil rights course that I teach, dtubs@tkc.edu. We'd be flattered to receive emails from people wanting to read books that we're recommending. There is a question here about critical race theory and the Christian message. And would you like to say something about how you as a Christian woman understand critical race theory? Is it a perspective that is going to, in the future, frame the conversation about race relations in the United States? Do you think that that might be where we're going? So I think the audience member is looking for a specifically Christian assessment of critical race theory.
So one of the problems I have with this idea of critical race theory is that critical race theory is so expansive. There's so much that's in critical race theory that I first of all, I want to proclaim that I am no expert. And second of all, I think that one would have to be much more, it would take a long time to cover all that's involved. But I want to speak to a couple of aspects of it. The idea that race is a social construct, I think, is a really important idea that we as Christians ought to engage. That there is, in fact, the biologists have concluded, no biological basis for race. Why do they say that? You can see, just look on this Zoom screen, you can see that Dr. Tubbs looks white and I look black, and there's obviously some biological, my children are not going to be born looking like Dr. Tubbs, and his children won't just be born looking like me unless he marries someone who looks like me. So why am I saying there's no biological basis? Because what they have found is that the genetic variation within any racial group is greater than the genetic variation across racial groups. So there is some relationship, but it is not a tight relationship. It's not a biological relationship. It's not something that a biologist can define. That's number one. Number two, if you look at the social history of the United States, Noel Ignatieff has this excellent book, How the Irish Became White, in which he describes the fact that when the Irish arrive in the United States, they're not considered to be white people. Yes. And as a result of that, it is really a social process through which they buy into the American identity, part of which is rejecting their early affiliation with African Americans in order to obtain the status of being white. It's not that their genes changed, it's that how they were perceived and treated changed. Something similar happens to Jews. Mm-hmm. In fact, if you look much more recently, there's a one-drop rule concerning race in the United States. The one-drop rule says that if you have one drop of black blood, you are black. So Walter White, who was head of the NAACP during the Civil Rights Movement, looked a lot like Dr. Tubbs. When I first saw him, a photograph of Walter White, I did not realize that he was black, but he was black. So if he were on this Zoom screen, you would be thinking that there were two white men, when in fact, there was a white man and a black man. It's all constructed. And until recently, the census treated anybody what's more, the census itself identified. So if you were Walter White and you wanted to pass for white, you could claim to be white on the census. But now the census has gone even further because now there's a multi-race category. So you can say, I'm not black, I'm not white, I am mixed. I'm biracial, right? There's a biracial category. All of that is about the social construction of race. The other idea I want to raise for Christians from critical race theory is structural racism. I've been talking about it, right? I've been saying that there are certain structures. There are school systems which disadvantage Black students and advantage white students. The racial segregation in housing advantages white people, advantages white students, disadvantages Black students. There is such a thing as structural racism. And I think we as Christians have to engage at least those aspects of critical race theory.
And do you think, if this is my little follow-up,
Sure.
do you think that critical race theory, as you understand it, is it deeply immersed in history? So for example, a point that I often make in the civil rights course, when I reflect on the history of economic injustices that Black Americans have experienced, and I give a lot of attention to the economic injustices of segregation, sharecropping, and so forth, because I live in a small town in New Jersey in which there are several white families, third, fourth generation, and they could be described as working class families that have stayed in this community for a long time because they find it desirable. And they are solidly middle class. They are solidly middle class. And what I think it indicates to me is that there are a lot of people in the United States, white people in the United States, who have achieved stability over generations, are solidly middle class, maybe even upper middle class, and maybe very few people in their family historically have gone to college or university. What I think the injustice here is that whites earning more over time and, so to speak, playing by the rules, they have more to pass on to their children, and then more gets passed on to the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. And this provides a very important margin of safety if there's family crisis, personal crisis, and so forth. And I look at the economic injustices experienced by Black Americans in the United States, and I say the margin of safety for so many African Americans today is much, much smaller because of these economic injustices in the past. So I want to focus attention on history. I mean, because I think the history should be intelligible. Most people should be able to appreciate this point.
Oh, that is so true, which is why I recommend When Affirmative Action Was White, because it looks at that history. Another book that I think is relevant here is Black Wealth, White Wealth, which looks at the fact that just the point that you're making, that somebody who has a small advantage 100 years ago, but is experiencing the effects of compound interest. 100 years later, their advantage is exponentially greater than the person, than the Black person. And I would also suggest, Dr. Kabiawu, maybe this is a book that might interest you. I haven't even read it yet, but I'm so entranced by it that I'm recommending it already. It's called The Whiteness of Wealth, which is speaking to the way the structure of the tax system and other economic systems disadvantages African Americans. So it is all based in history, but it also continues in current structures.
Another question from the audience about the phrase Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter as a movement. So two separate questions. First, how, in your judgment, as a Black Christian, how do you think white Christians should respond if somebody says, well, people say Black Lives Matter, but really all lives matter? What would be an appropriate response for a white Christian, in your judgment? Second question, Black Lives Matter as a moral principle versus Black Lives Matter as a social movement and now an organization. Could you comment on that as well?
Okay. I think that's a very difficult question. Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter. As Christians, as human beings, all lives matter. That's true. However, the phrase, when someone says Black Lives Matter, it's saying up to this point, in theory, all lives matter, but in practice, Black lives have not mattered. And I think that that's true. If you look even at the opioid epidemic, when there was a crack epidemic and the majority of the addicts were Black, or when there was a heroin epidemic prior to that, majority of the addicts were Black. It was a matter of, it wasn't public health, it was public safety, it was criminal justice. When there's an opioid epidemic and the majority of the addicts are white, there's a different approach taken. Is it because some lives matter more than others? So I guess my response would be, if I were white and somebody said that to me, I would say, it's important for us to underscore and underline that Black lives do matter because they've been treated in the past as though they don't. However, when it comes to the movement, I do think that that's very problematic. I think that there are a number of positions taken which are anathema to Christians. The most important is there is a connection between one of the founders, Patrice Curlers, I think, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, and African animist religions, which are at odds with Christian teaching. So I think it behooves Christians not to readily embrace the organization Black Lives Matter, because one doesn't want to get caught up in these various religious heterodoxies. But in addition to that, there are issues around sexuality and gender, which are very close to the heart, if not at the core of Black Lives Matter, that have nothing to do with racial justice. And that as Christians, most of us as Orthodox Christians take a very different position on. So again, I think that Christians would be wise to be very judicious in their interaction with or support for the organization. But what I've called on students who have asked me this question before, what I've said to them is, what can you do? Can we Christians, especially white Christians, have our own organization that's standing up for racial justice? Can we launch our own movement? Can we go on social media? Can we turn out tens of thousands of people in support of racial justice so that people can see that Jesus cares about everybody, that he cares about Black people as much as he cares about white people? I think that that would be the best response to Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. So we're just about out of time, but can I ask you to give a very brief answer to my final prepared question? And that is, could you tell us just a little bit, because you and your husband reside in Boston and you co-direct the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. Can you tell us in 90 seconds or less what Seymour Institute has as its mission and some of its recent projects, please?
Great. So Reverend Rivers is a founder and director. I'm executive director. And the goal is really to try and get the Black church engaged on issues of social policy, issues that are important in the Black community. Most recently, we've done a round of essays and statement on the Equality Act, because we see religious freedom, which is critical to the Black church, as being threatened by this act, which builds on the Civil Rights Act and extends it to SOGI, so sexual orientation and gender identity issues, but at the same time guts the Religious Freedom Act, so that we in the Black church who do not share these opinions on social orientation and gender identity would be at risk. So we engage on that kind of issue. We're also launching a seminar on white supremacy and domestic terrorism, picking up on issues. We were actually working on this before the attack on January 6th. We're really wanting the church to engage, not just the Black church, but the white church as well. What do we do about white supremacy and domestic terrorism? We also have a project going on post-secular science. The idea that science is not at odds with faith and religion, but in fact, for us as Christians, we know that it grows out of all of God's wisdom and goodness. How do we shape a theory of science that allows for that instead of a materialist conception of science, which is at odds with the very conception of God. And we do some on the ground stuff. We do a middle school academic summer program where we actually work with kids in Boston. We have bringing students up from a small Catholic college, and we teach them, you know, just to try and deal with some of the issues around educational inequity that Black students face.
That was a fine summary. So thank you for that. And
You're
we are out of time. So I wanted to say good night to everyone. Wanted to thank you, Dr. Rivers, for agreeing to this interview, Dr. Kabiawu for posing questions along with me. So thank you again to all of you for attending. We hope that it's been an edifying program for you, and we congratulate Dr. Rivers as for her appointment as a Senior Fellow of the Center. Good night to all. Bye-bye.